is that monitor going to be reflective of where I live? Or if you're in Stony Creek or Flamborough. So we really wanted to understand what air quality looks like across the entire city. Just as a note, I live in Dundas myself and have been in Hamilton since 2011. And then, and this part we're not going to touch on too much because it's still work we're doing, is how do those air pollution concentrations change along with socioeconomic characteristics? Early research in Hamilton in the 90s identified that there were socioeconomic gradients to air pollution. What that means is disproportionate exposure. So those, I'll give an example of income. Those with lower incomes tended to be exposed to more pollution than those individuals with higher incomes. And we're interested to understand, do these gradients exist in Hamilton as well? We won't be sharing that until later because we've just finished the air pollution surfaces and the spatial analysis. So that's what we'll be presenting on today. So, our primary question, what does air quality look like across the city of Hamilton? I think that's why most of us are here. And then looking at those socioeconomic characteristics. We're looking at a few different air pollutants that we're talking about. And so I'm going to kind of contextualize each of these. So nitrogen dioxide belongs to this family we often refer to as NOx. And this is a really great tracer for transportation-related air pollution. Any fossil fuel burning is going to emit a combination of nitric oxide and nitrogen dioxide. And in the air, they tend to form, the nitric oxide forms NO2. And so this is a great pollutant to understand effects of transportation. Ozone, nothing emits ozone. So it forms actually with the presence of other chemicals, one of those being NOx, as well as volatile organic compounds. Heard about ozone concerns in Hamilton, it's during the summer or across all of the GTA. It's that summer weather, the sun and heat. Sorry, I'm just gonna check something on my end, but hopefully my internet should be fine. I'm plugged right in. So ozone can have great short-term health effects because we often see big peaks in the summer, major increases, tenfold increases during the day. We see that related to cardiorespiratory illnesses and disease. Sulfur dioxide, this is an industrial pollutant. It used to be more prevalent across Ontario before coal-fired power plants were removed, but we'll see it's still an issue here in Hamilton. And then we looked at benzene and then PAHs. So benzene, industrial pollutant, also a component of gasoline. And then pH is like a host of these components or pollutants that are largely going to be associated with industry. So what's kind of unique in our study compared to most other studies that looked across space is we captured all seasons. So what's happening in the winter versus the spring, summer. That's going to be important in the long run as we really try to understand what specific patterns are going on, but it also ensures that we've captured all of the different conditions when we present you the data you're going to see today. It's not just representing summer conditions or winter or a different season. It's representing that annual exposure, really thinking about that long-term exposure. How did we do this? So the Ministry of the Environment, for example, operates very large infrastructure to measure air pollution, and they're able to measure hourly concentrations because of this. The approach we took is what we call integrated sampling, where we get filters and we use street lights in our case, and we can hang those filters on there for 2 weeks up to 2 months, depending on what we're measuring. And then we take them back to our laboratory, we analyze them, we can figure out how much of that pollutant was in the air. Now, it doesn't give us those hour-by-hour measurements, but what it does allow us to do is measure really wherever we want. There's nowhere in the city without street poles of some sort really accessible, especially where people live, which is what we're really interested in. So we're able to capture what air pollution looks like across space, near and around where people are living. So we captured, just as to reiterate, nitrogen dioxide, also nitric oxide, and the sum of those two. We're talking about nitrogen dioxide today because it is a component of NOx associated to health effects. ozone, sulfur dioxide, benzene, and then PAHs, UFO-shaped discs hanging off a telephone pole here in Hamilton. Those are a bit different. Those were out there for 2 months, and right now we're presenting on the summertime measurements. We're still analyzing the winter, but they capture PAHs, or these chemicals that are highly toxic in many cases. The one that we've been typically measuring and monitoring in Hamilton is benzoapyrene. It's of great interest. It's been elevated in Hamilton for a very long time. There are known sources of benzoapyrene. Our industrial processes do emit it into the Hamilton airshed. So this is something we are well aware is occurring in our community, and it was of really great interest from the city. Public health is coming from the public. So this is something that has not really been measured to this extent across Hamilton ever. So, really important work to really get a sense of what's going on. There's a whole host of PAHs that we can look at as well, in addition to benzoapyrene. So just reiterating how we went through this process. So unlike a lot of the research that we do, or a lot of projects that get undertaken, where often the community comes in at the end of the project, we really try to engage the community. And this was, I thought, very critical researchers to understand where the community concerns were. So going back to December of 2021, we held our first meeting. And we got a lot of wonderful insight from the community members who attended that, highlighting your areas of concern. And we took all of that information back with us, and we found about 50 different locations across the city of Hamilton by the time we aggregated all of the areas of concern and community points. So very helpful. We also had email and website material that you could send in those concerns. Followed that up with a meeting in April where people learned about regulatory and enforcement in Ontario. The Ministry of the Environment, Conservation, Parks, Health Canada, Hamilton Public Health really demonstrated the number of actors who are involved in the airshed. Here are our community interest points. We can see they are very much in and around our industrial core. As well, we do note that, throughout Hamilton, there are other concerns as well. So air quality is not just an industrial concern. And if we look at this aligns to what's going on in Hamilton. In the 70s, 80s, the industry would have dominated the pollution in the airshed. However, declining industry also paired with improvements in air pollution capture and process improvements have shown significant reductions over time in industrial related air pollutants, which is a very good and important thing that's been happening. But some of that's being offset by more vehicles on the road. I think all of us are aware of the congestion on the Link, the Red Hill, the QEW, the 403 that surround much of our city. Every evening and most mornings, all of those roads are quite congested. Lots of vehicles. These also are major pathways for goods movement, shipping of goods to Buffalo through to Detroit. So it's a big pathway. So lots of emissions in our area that's sort of offsetting some of the benefits we might have expected coming from the industry reductions. So how did we select our sites? Because you're going to see that we measured at many sites. We can't measure everywhere. So first thing, we have a good number of active monitors. So these are those MOECP monitors, also the Hamilton Air Monitoring Network, which is an industry-led monitoring network. And then the city of Hamilton operates 2 air monitors as well. So we wanted to make sure or evaluate our measurement technique against those air monitors. And that's really important because at the end of the day, we want to make sure we have values that can be considered, similar quality to the Ministry of the Environment air monitors. And that's really important as we move forward with this data. So you can see where those exist across Hamilton, focused around the industry, but there are some a little bit further afield in Westdale and up on the mountain. We thought, okay, where can we measure? This is every street light post in Hamilton, so there's plenty of them. So it wasn't an issue about where, but where we could, but where should we measure? So first thing, we wanted to make sure we captured every ward. So what we did is we used the land of the wards and sites of every ward. What's average conditions we'd expect for a ward? And we did among those 15 locations. Following that, we went and we started doing what we called population sites. So this was really trying to balance these population characteristics that we were interested in. We wanted to locate a few more samplers with higher population density. So we wanted to capture more measurements where there's more people living. We also wanted to capture measurements at different distances from highways, different distances from industrial land, areas where there's open land. We wanted to make sure to capture those various conditions that occur across Hamilton. And then we also looked at what's called a marginalization index. And this is a measure of those socioeconomic characteristics of the population that looks at 4 different dimensions, but these dimensions are associated with health risk in general. So these, the higher, more marginalized a community is, non-air pollution related risks are there. So we wanted to make sure to capture high areas of risk and areas of low risk, so we could combine those. We selected these 45 population sites to really capture those characteristics we thought would be important in understanding how air pollution not just varies across space, but across how our population in Hamilton varies. And this is what we came up with. So very extensive air monitoring program. I would say it's probably one of the most dense air monitoring programs of its sort that has happened in Canada. It's not often that you see this number of sites being sampled through an entire year. So we now have in Hamilton a very great wealth of additional air quality information. So we have those MOECP monitors, the Hammond monitors, and the City of Hamilton tracking long-term trends. And then we have these additional air monitors that now we have a sense of what it looks like across space. Each site was sampled for 2 weeks during every season. And that my research group has done a lot of work to say that's a really good representative amount of time. So we sampled 1/3 of all of these sites every month. The sites located with the Ministry of the Environment monitors were sampled every month. So we could see those comparisons every single month. The pH monitors, they capture pollution a little bit slower compared to the others, as well as there's a lot less of it, thankfully. So they were installed for 2 months. So those are the sites we captured, which were a balance of population characteristics, areas of concern from the community. Oh, I forgot to mention that after we used those population characteristics, we also looked at choosing a set of sites that best represented those areas that the community were concerned about. So that gave us these sites here, a great coverage across really all of Hamilton. A lot more you can see in the core between the Link, the Red Hill, 403 QEW. A lot of people live down there, and also a lot of different conditions. You have very different wind patterns above and below the escarpment, for example. So lots going on there. You may have seen us out in the field. And so one of the things we wanted to do is make sure people were aware of what was going on. So you may have received a pamphlet if you were living in the area adjacent to one of these monitors in your mailbox. And we'd have some information about what was going on with the air monitors. And we did really great. We only lost a couple throughout the entire multi-season sampling, which is really good. Typically, we would expect to lose maybe 3 to 5% of the monitors. It can be everything from just pure vandalism to, sometimes we've had street poles removed when communications have sort of broken down between us and our partners of what's going on. But we retained almost all of our data, which was excellent. So now the part you're probably most interested in why you're here. What did we find? So when we looked at our sampling, and this is probably most interesting to the hardcore scientists in the room, we found really good replication between our samples. So when we took 2 of our monitors and we placed 2 of our monitors in different locations, we saw very little difference in those measurements, which is important, when we're thinking about quality control and quality assurance. So really good there for most of our monitoring, and it was, just good support. When we looked at how our monitors agreed to the ministry monitors, very small differences, 1 or maybe 2 part per million differences, which is excellent. We're never going to be spot on. Honestly, if you put 2 of the world's best instruments for measuring these pollutants right beside each other, you could be off by this much. So, we're well within the amount of variation that we would want to see to make sure that our measurements are comparable to the ministry measurements. So that was really good. We did see a bit poorer performance in cooler temperatures. And this is actually really important because a lot of these techniques were designed in areas of warmer climates. We didn't actually know how well they perform in the winter months. So we had a sense, but we didn't have as much data as we do now. So we can do a few little temperature-based corrections as well and be a bit more confident in that. So that was really excellent for us as well. And in Hamilton, where we do experience colder winters. So nitrogen dioxide, this is that transportation-related air pollutant. So it's emitted from vehicles and from industry. And we see, first thing we notice, if we look at the Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standard, and this is the 2025 upcoming standard, that's 12 parts per billion. And we see that we're reaching, we're below that concentration or right at the edge in our worst spot. So that's a really good thing, that this transportation-related air pollutant isn't exceeding the upcoming Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standard. We do see more of the pollution in downtown. This is not really surprising, but it's not just related to that industrial core. It's really related to what's going on with traffic in the lower city paired with the industrial core. And that is what really we would expect. As we move further into the rural community, the concentrations just drop off. So it's about a 10 part per billion increase, which is pretty substantial. You wouldn't see 10 ppb differences between cities in Canada, for example, on an annual average. So across the city, this pollutant does vary. We meet the Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standard across all of the city, and that's a really good thing. But there is more pressure of this pollutant in the downtown core. No big surprises here, which is always a good thing. But a lot of good confirmation of what we may have expected on that spatial patterns of these air pollutants. The next one we looked at is ozone. And ozone, we typically expect it to be lower in areas where there's higher nitrogen dioxide. The reason is, as nitrogen dioxide is forming, it actually steals one of the oxygen molecules from ozone to form NO2. So you see those ozone concentrations typically lower in urban areas. The big takeaway is if we look at the Hamilton West monitor, which is our least urban of the Hamilton air monitoring, of the air monitors from the MOECP or Hammond that's in our region, very low, like within our city. It's the least urbanized, but it is still adjacent to some major roads. If we were to use that to represent air quality across Hamilton, it would do a good job for individuals in the city, but it would really underestimate ozone for individuals who are in rural communities. So my takeaway for this, from kind of a health perspective, ozone is an infrequent issue, but when it does become an issue, it really spikes up. So I think we need to think about ozone-related air pollution really in our rural communities, because it may actually be underestimating what they're exposed to, as opposed to just being able to use those measurements from the city. But the air monitors from the MOECP represent urban exposure to ozone quite well, but not so much rural exposure to ozone. It really is probably underestimating. So it's something we just need to keep in mind as we move forward to understand risk associated with ozone. Sulfur dioxide, this is really an industrial related pollutant this day and age. We see generally low concentrations across most of the city. Unfortunately, along Beach Boulevard, we do continue to see elevated concentrations from the industry. These are, known issues. It does increase in the lower city around the industry. Now, when we look at time resolved measurements from those MOECP monitors that are going every hour, we see big spikes in SO2. So the challenge with interpreting our maps here is these are good at representing long-term patterns, but it could be the case where, for whatever reason, meteorology and industrial process that's going on combined, and you could see really high concentrations in especially the lower city. So we still need to be paying attention to this pollutant within really anything below the escarpment. And it does spike, especially in the summer. You can see concentrations that are 10 times higher than what you maybe expect, up to 25 times higher. So it's very spiky. It might be really high one day and it'll drop down and be low again for a week or two. So we need to keep paying attention to SO2. Long term though, Beach Boulevard is experiencing quite high concentrations over the long term. Benzene, I don't have a nice map for benzene, and I'll tell you why, and that's a good thing. Benzene techniques aren't as well developed. There aren't as many available. And so the approach we were using would have been really great to capture high or very high concentrations of benzene. Thankfully, we didn't see those across the city. The concentrations we did see really were right in what Hammond's air monitoring, the long-term monitoring networks were showing. So no real wild patterns. And this was a bit more exploratory because we knew a little bit less about where benzene's going. But thankfully, we didn't see anything too out of the ordinary. And I'm really happy about that because benzene is not a great pollutant to be exposed to. Benzoate-pyrene, this is an industrial pollutant. And we do have known sources in Hamilton. Hamilton has some of the highest emissions or known emissions of these pollutants in Ontario. And unfortunately, what we see is across almost the entire city of Hamilton, really all of the urban areas, that benzoate-pyrene is above Ontario's ambient air quality criteria, really everywhere. Concentrations are highest as you get closer to that industrial core, but it's fairly extensive, the elevated concentrations that we saw. So it's still a problem. We've known it's been a problem for a while, but one thing I wasn't expecting was maybe the spatial extent of benzoate-pyrene as a pollutant in our urban areas. So something we definitely want to keep track of as we move forward. When we look at all of the PAHs, so a while back, the EPA identified 16 key PAHs that were concerning. Our technique's able to measure 15 of those 16. One of them is just, it just doesn't stay on a filter long enough to analyze it. What we see is most of the pollution, again, of those 15 being around that industrial core. So very well tracked to benzoate-pyrene. So benzoate-pyrene is used as the indicator of pH risk, really, within kind of the Ontario context. It's the one with an air quality criteria from Ontario. And so we wanted to make sure, is this a representative pollutant for the mix of pollution in Hamilton? And what you can do with PAHs is not all PAHs are the same. Some are less toxic, some are more toxic. And so what you can do is multiply their concentrations by how toxic they are. And what we saw is benzoate-pyrene for our samples represents about 50% of the toxicity, which is a lot. Half of how toxic those pollutants are is represented by this one pollutant in the mix. And when we looked at the next three, they were also very highly correlated. What that means is when benzoate was high, so were the other ones that were high risk factors. So our takeaway for benzoate is it's a really great, a useful indicator for this whole suite of pollutants that you may be exposed to in Hamilton. So I'm just going to kind of conclude now before we get into Q&A, because I see we're at coming up to 7:40. So nitrogen dioxide, highest around the industrial area, but also it really does have across most of all that lower city elevated concentrations. SO2 dispersed around the industrial center, very heavily though concentrated near that industry. Ozone, highest in rural regions, as we would expect, but maybe quite a bit higher than what the air monitors in Hamilton are suggesting. So it's something to keep an eye on, especially during those peak ozone days. So taking those AQHI alerts very seriously in the rural areas. Just because you live in a rural area, you may not be thinking about air pollution, but ozone is one of the contributors to the air quality health index. And if ozone's high, so does the AQHI. So it may be associated to the type of pollution that you're exposed to in a rural area. Benzoate is maybe a bit more than I would have expected, elevated across all of the locations in urban areas of our city. To contextualize the benzoate exposure in the, around that industrial area, you would be roughly exposed to the same amount of benzoate that you would be for smoking a cigarette. That reduces as you move out, but you probably back the napkin estimates, everyone in Hamilton is smoking probably 1 or 2 cigarettes a week at baseline worth of this pollutant. I know it's not a perfect analogy, but it is one that I think people can understand, kind of give a sense of the magnitude of this potential health risk. So that's all I had for today. Thank you for everything, and sorry for whatever went on there, but I'm glad we were able to get back to the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing here before we move into questions so I can see a bit better.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I will remove your spotlight and I'm going to share my screen now before I hand it over to Sally. Just give me 1 second, please. So yeah, I'll just ask Sally Radisik from the city of Hamilton to unmute, and I will spotlight you for everyone, and take it away, Sally.
Thank you, Ian. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sally Radisik. I'm the health hazard specialist with the City of Hamilton Public Health Services. Thank you for the opportunity to share the information regarding wildfire smoke and air quality. I did see a question come in through the chat, so hopefully some of this will answer that question. Until this year in Hamilton, we really haven't had to address wildfire smoke. At the local level, it's really been a concern across many cities in Canada, typically from the west or the east end, where dense smoke is produced as a result of forests and grasslands burning. With the impacts of climate change, however, wildfire smoke is expected to continue, since Canada, of course, is warming much faster than other places in the world, and it's providing these ideal conditions for more frequent and longer wildfires. And hence here, we're going to probably expect to see more wildfire smoke impacting the city of Hamilton moving forward throughout that wildfire season, which is typically from April to October in the year. So I'll just move to the next slide, Ian. So what is the challenge with wildfire smoke is that it's difficult to predict when these fires will occur. It's also difficult to predict how big they will be in size and really how much smoke they will generate. Also, the direction that the smoke will travel is difficult to predict. And sometimes we see that when the fires are burning in Quebec and Northern Ontario like they were this summer, they do impact us here locally in the city of Hamilton. And we see that, these transboundary sources originating outside of the city of Hamilton impact us locally. And wildfire smoke does have the potential to be carried from hundreds and even thousands of kilometers away from the source itself. If we can go to the next slide, Ian, that would be great. Thanks. In early June this year, we quickly saw how wildfire smoke became a major source of air pollution for us in the city of Hamilton. And as Dr. Matt Adams mentioned, looking at the Air Quality Health Index, the AQHI is critical. We noted that this summer we had an AQHI value during the wildfire events impacting our city at a value of 10, which is high risk. So that's very concerning. Wildfire smoke is a complex mixture of pollutants. It includes sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, ozone, and PM 2.5 or particulate matter. And it's really these fine particles, this PM 2.5, that are not visible to the human eye, but they have the potential to get deep into our lungs. They have the potential to get into our bloodstream and the potential to cause adverse health effect. It is these fine particles that pose the main health risks for wildfire smoke. Smoke can impact our health at very low levels. It's important to be cognizant of that, and that air pollution may be present even when we can't see it or smell it. Hence, again, we encourage looking at the Air Quality Health Index to know what the levels are, to know what the risks are, and to know what health messages to follow in order to protect your health. We can go to the next slide. So what are some of the symptoms associated with exposure to wildfire smoke? There are milder symptoms that are more common, which include headaches. They include a mild cough, phlegm production, watery, sore eyes. They include nose, throat, and sinus irritation. Typically, if one is experiencing these milder symptoms, they do not require any medical intervention. They will just go away on their own once you remove yourself from that exposure. However, there are also serious symptoms that include dizziness, chest pain, cough that is severe, shortness of breath, wheezing, heart palpitations. Also, they include stroke. They could include a heart attack. They could also include premature death. And these more serious symptoms really do require urgent medical attention to be followed up with immediately. If we can go to the next slide. So we are all, of course, at risk of experiencing adverse health effects from exposure to the air pollution that is caused by wildfire smoke. However, there are some individuals, people that are at increased risk, and these individuals include pregnant people, they include people who smoke, they include young children or infants, they include individuals who work outdoors and who do not have respite from the wildfire smoke. They also include individuals who are participating in outdoor activities that may be strenuous. Also individuals who have pre-existing lung conditions or pre-existing heart conditions. Older adults are also at increased risk, those individuals who are 65 years of age or older. It's also important to note that older adults often will suffer from comorbidities. So they may have pre-existing lung conditions and pre-existing heart conditions. We also want to make note that individuals who have diabetes are considered to be at increased risk, as well as those individuals who are suffering from cancer or undergoing cancer treatment. If we can go to the next slide. So how do we protect our health from wildfire smoke exposure? We can do that by, of course, reducing the exposure to wildfire smoke itself. And we can check the local air quality to determine if it's safe to be outside and outdoors. We can check that AQHI information on airhealth.ca, or we can go to airqualityoontario.com. And we want to limit our outdoor activities or any strenuous physical activities as much as possible. We want to pay attention, of course, to special air quality statements issued by Environment Canada. And it's really important that we stop our activities if we are experiencing any symptoms associated with exposure to wildfire smoke. Additionally, what we want to do is we want to protect the indoor air quality. We want to prevent any of the wildfire smoke from entering into our indoor space. And we want to do that by properly sealing our windows, our doors, and keeping them closed and when the temperature is comfortable. So it's a key here is that the temperature must be comfortable. During those extreme heat days, we want to ensure that we have air conditioning. If we do not have access to indoor air conditioning within our premises that we're staying, we want to be able to visit community places that have both cool and clean air. And these community places are available on our website. They include libraries, they include shopping malls, they include rec centers and community centers, senior centers. So they are listed on the City of Hamilton website. Again, if individuals are experiencing any adverse effects, any symptoms associated with wildfire smoke exposure, they are recommended to contact a healthcare provider. And also if they're experiencing any mental health issues, to also urgently contact a healthcare provider. So the smoke that we are being exposed to is going to be something that's going to be more prevalent in the City of Hamilton. As we mentioned in the onset of this discussion, it hasn't been something that we have had to address previously, but it looks like we should be preparing for it moving forward. So I thank you so much for your attention, and I do look forward to the discussions throughout this session. Ian, so I am done, and we can move on to the next presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sally. I'm just gonna give it over to Trevor. Trevor, please take it away. Trevor from the City of Hamilton, everyone.
Great, thanks Ian, and thank you, Sally. Hi everyone, my name's Trevor Imhoff. I'm the Senior Project Manager. Sorry, Ian, next slide, but perfect. I'm the Senior Project Manager in the newly created Office of Climate Change Initiatives that was formed in December of 2022. However, before this, I spent approximately 6.5 years working in public health with colleagues like Sally Radisik and others, including Matt Lawson and Shelley Rogers, who are on the call as well, working on air quality and climate change. And so I'm here to quickly present, and I know we have lots of very good questions, so I'll go fairly quickly through these slides, but we really wanted to provide an opportunity to present on Hamilton's climate action strategy and the correlation and the co-benefits of working on climate change and achieving the objectives and targets and actions within Hamilton's climate action strategy, and the co-benefits as it relates to air quality, for example, and I'll get into that in the next slide. So before I do, the Hamilton's Climate Action Strategy was approved by City Council in August of 2022. It included two very large and extensive plans, including Recharge Hamilton, which is the first one here that you see on your screen, Hamilton's Community Energy and Emissions Plan. Thanks, Ian. And that is our what we call the climate mitigation plan. So when I refer to mitigation, I'm referring to actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So think about, as Dr. Adams said, things related to fossil fuels. So the reduction of gasoline and diesel, those fuels that also cause harmful coal use, for example, those fuels that cause harmful air pollution as well. And so this plan is really about significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions to ultimately achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, ideally before 2050. And then equally important, we have Hamilton's Climate Impact Adaptation Plan. And that was using regional and global climate models downscaled to the local level, and then we undertook a vulnerability and risk assessment based on that science of climate change to inform the actions of how best we can prepare for climate change. Because unfortunately, if we were to reduce emissions 100% today, because of the slow carbon cycle in the atmosphere, we would still continue to experience climate change impacts for the foreseeable future because of all of the emissions that have already been emitted into the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So the Community Energy and Emissions Plan underwent an extensive analysis of citywide, not just the city as a corporation, but community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. And so this slide shows our existing, as of 2022, inventory year. And we follow a very recognized global protocol called the GPC, or the Global Protocol for Community-Wide Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reporting. And this is essentially the protocol that all leading municipalities around the world and business as as well follow in order to calculate greenhouse gas emissions. And so when we look at Hamilton, Hamilton is a unique city in that, as we have talked about already, it does have a dense industrial core and industrial facilities in Hamilton. However, there is a lot of momentum in this space, specifically as it relates to the decarbonization and phase out of coal use in steelmaking in Hamilton. But even if those organizations and those companies reduce their emissions totally, we still have significant sources from what I call the big three. And so the other two are transportation and buildings. Transportation emissions generally coming from the combustion of fossil fuels, from gasoline and diesel, mainly attributed to personal use vehicles, just because of the vast amount, as Dr. Adams talked about, the vast amount of the number of vehicles on the road. And then buildings from both fossil fuel use of space heating, generally from natural gas or propane, and water heating as well. I did want to note too, in a net zero future, all sources of greenhouse gas emissions matter. And so although they are significantly less, we will need to address greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and waste. And so there's we have high confidence that by achieving the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from these sectors, there will also be several co-benefits that will lead to a more healthy community, will help the health and the livelihood of Hamiltonians, specifically as it relates to air quality and the reduction of harmful air pollution, but also for more active living styles, taking active and sustainable forms of transportation, living more comfortably in your homes, as Dr. Sally Radisik mentioned, sealing your home and having a more high performance building envelope will help to protect homeowners and people living in their dwelling from outside air quality as well. So there is a lot of co-benefits in achieving Hamilton's climate action strategy, in also reducing exposure to harmful air pollution. Next slide, please. And so just a very quickly, as I mentioned, we are a new and small but mighty office. I am joined by Dr. Linda Lukaszek, who I believe is on the call as well. And so we formed this office in December of 2022. We went to council in April of 2023 with our priority focus areas. And these are our priority areas for 2023. And before I quickly go through these, I also just wanted to note that these are the priority areas that our office is specifically focusing on and leading, in addition to the coordination and oversight of the overall implementation of Hamilton's climate action strategy. There are also, though, various climate change related initiatives happening across the city of Hamilton currently. And just quickly to name a few that have a direct relation to air quality exposure, for example, is the truck route master plan approval that now does not allow heavy trucks, which does have a more burdensome air quality exposure perspective, from going into lower ward neighborhoods and downtown area. So there is confidence that that will help to reduce exposure as well. We are also, as a city, moving forward on a transformational light rail transit system that people can stop taking personal use vehicles to get across the entire city. But also we're wanting to supplement that higher order transit with more rapid bus lanes, as well as some active forms of transportation, accelerating the cycling master plan, piloting e-scooters as well. That is just happening this year as well. So that's just some of the snapshots that of actions that are happening from other departments and divisions beyond the Office of Climate Change Initiatives. And very quickly, when I go over the priority focus areas for our office, the first one is climate change governance and innovation. And that's really about getting the proper coordination, both internally in the city of Hamilton, creating director level steering committees so that every department across the city is taking action on climate change, but also forming a community climate change advisory committee. And although those applications closed on Friday, I I do invite anyone to visit our Engage website, which will be in the coming slides, to stay involved on that very important external governance piece to ensure that there's that transparency to climate change reporting, as well as to ensure that all voices from the community are heard in the implementation and through the transition and the decarbonization to a net zero future. Community climate change outreach is a very big priority. I think between Linda and I, we at least do three to four sessions, maybe a week, on climate change and the importance of Hamilton's climate action strategy. We need everyone involved, and we need action from everyone to achieve the net zero future. And so we're really committed to not only raising the awareness of what climate change is, the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, but also focusing on hope and what actions people can do, both in the small in your household, but also are the other larger actions as well. We did get approval to undertake carbon budgeting, and what that essentially is looking at an analysis of global greenhouse gas emissions and identifying what Hamilton's citywide fair share is, and developing an annual carbon budget with some tools, analysis, and resources that senior leadership in the city, as well as council, can make informed decisions on their annual budget to ensure, and setting caps on those carbon budgets to ensure that we're making the best decisions possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Green buildings is really the understanding that we need to not only retrofit almost every building in Hamilton. Hamilton does have a fairly old building stock, and we're moving forward and got approval to launch the Better Homes Hamilton, a building retrofit pilot program, which I'll get into in a second, but is also developing a net zero corporate net zero building policy, and definitely not last but not least is urban greening, and that's really the intent that and our commitment on climate justice spans all of the priorities and the overall implementation of the climate action strategy. But this specifically in terms of urban greening is focusing on growing the urban tree canopy to help improve the micro ecosystems and the lives of people in those neighborhoods that don't necessarily have as much green space as other wards or other areas. And so focusing on those high priority needs for those urban areas and the urban greening projects. Next slide, please. And just to end off, here's how you can stay involved. Please feel free to visit Hamilton's Climate Action Strategy website. The link is there. I also wanted to mention our Better Homes Hamilton Engage website. We did get approval to launch the pilot program, which is expected to launch before the end of 2023. And that will provide up to $1 million in loans to property owners, so maximum of $20,000 per property, with a 0% interest as a loan to retrofit your home to become more energy efficient. So focusing on that building envelope performance, which, as we talked about, has that co-benefit of outdoor air quality exposure, or the reduction of that, but as well as reducing your reliance on fossil fuels and significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions through building envelope performance, but as well as mechanical fuel switching to air source heat pumps. And of course, and last but not least, is our Community Climate Change Advisory Committee. Please feel free to email me or our general email, climatechange@hamilton.ca, and visit our Climate Champions website for more information, including the terms of reference and additional information related to the Community Climate Change Advisory Committee. And with that, I'll say thank you so much and looking forward to the question and answer period.
Thank you, Trevor. I'm going to now take this spotlight. And just to wrap things up before we get to the Q&A section, I just wanted to really hone in on a few pieces that were mentioned already. This is an ongoing generational issue within our city of Hamilton. And we would be remiss as Environment Hamilton to end this off without mentioning that it's incredibly important to address these emissions and to address this air quality issue as a political issue. It's incredibly important that everyone shows up onto this Zoom call, but more importantly than that, that we put pressure on our local decision makers to make right by us. And so I absolutely encourage everyone on this call to stay involved with us, stay involved with this ongoing project, and stay involved with the ongoing climate movement and environmental movement in the city of Hamilton that has gone some pretty significant gains over the last few decades, but there's a lot more work to be done. So we just want to, before we go to the Q&A, really highlight that when it comes to talking about how wildfire smoke is affecting us, that's a federal issue and a provincial issue, not a municipal issue. There's nothing the city of Hamilton can do, but there are other levels of government that can do more to address climate change and air quality issues within our city, and there's more that needs to be done by them, and that needs to be reminded. With that, we're going to be going to the Q&A now. I'm going to be unsharing my screen so I can go through the Q&A. We have quite a few, and a number of them have been upvoted quite a bit. So the way this is going to work, it's 8:01. We're going to go until 8:15 at the very least, and then maybe a little bit later, but we're going to see how many questions we can get through initially here. I will be reading the questions out and then posing them to folks. Anyone who is on the call from either the City of Hamilton, U of T, or Environment Hamilton will hopefully be able to answer all of them. So my first question, and this is the top voted question, is from Maya K. Would you consider comparing this data against rates of cancer / known health conditions in the Hamilton population? And how will this data be used to inform action for the city / province? Matt, I'm going to hand that to you first to take a stab at it.
Yes, great, thank you. I'm going to talk about comparing against rates of cancer. Absolutely. I've been in talks with researchers at Health Canada already, now that we have this data. So we weren't able to do this in the past because we didn't know how air pollution varied really across space. I don't have those answers yet, and to be honest, it's time-consuming work. But hopefully, we're talking scale of 1, maybe 1.5 years. We'll have a good sense. We're going to start with cancer, all cancers, and then some specific cancers that we expect to be related to those pollutants of concern. And then how will this data be used to inform action for the city province? I think it's important to recognize that all of the major stakeholders sit around the conversation here. Health Canada began the engagement. Environment Canada is involved. The Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks in Ontario is involved. Public health unit here in Hamilton is involved. So I think the information is being shared as broadly as possible, at least through those channels. How that gets used into the future, I'm not someone who can really speak so much to that.
Yeah, I would just add there are some new technical standards that are up on the environmental registry that relate to some of these pollutants that have been put into the air that the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change is trying to address. The timelines that are being proposed for those new technical standards is another thing. But ultimately, this data is being shared with those levels of government, and we hope at Environment Hamilton that this data will come into a factor for those decision making. I have a couple other questions. I'm just going to try to keep it a little bit varied. But we have one question. How do we get industry to make improvements quickly? Media reports suggest that the US successfully forced industry to change while Canada lags. I'll take a first stab at this. It depends on where you're talking about in the US. Generally speaking, when it comes to industrial emissions, there are other regions that are doing a much better job than we are with significantly similar processes and facilities. I'm not familiar of how many of those are in the US. I'm certainly more familiar with facilities in Europe that are very similar to what we have here in Hamilton that do not have the same emission issues that we have here. I would simply say that to get industry to move quickly, government has to move quickly. Industry does what they are allowed to do. If you look at regulations in other countries, where regulations are more relaxed, industry is more relaxed. Where regulations are more strict, industry is more strict. And that's typically how it plays out, both when it comes to local air quality issues as well as emissions from greenhouse gas emissions generally as well. But I'll allow or I'll invite Matt or Trevor to weigh in on this if you'd like. I see, Trevor, you turned your camera on.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I don't have any further to add around increasing or how to accelerate. industrial reductions. That is the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. My understanding, working in public health over the past 6.5 years, there's multiple proactive regulations and also reactive enforcement protocols, but won't get into that. But in terms of a city's perspective, I did just want to quickly highlight that we had these conversations around Cleaner Hamilton many times around the co-benefits and the cross-cutting nature of air quality and climate change. So from a climate change staff person now, I believe this information will be useful to further provide that rationale and analysis to say, here's the problem, here's the air quality issues from these sectors, and by achieving the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, although we won't be able to, I think, specifically quantify the improvements, for example, by neighborhood, as I mentioned in my presentation, have high confidence that by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, there will ultimately be a co-benefit of air pollution, or the reduction of air pollution across the city as well.
Thank you, Trevor. Moving on, I have a good question here from Kathleen, and I think this will be for you, Matt. Does benzoapyrene have a smell? And what are its health impacts at the levels we've measured in Hamilton? So the typical health impacts of the levels that we've measured.
Great question. Does it have a smell? It has like an aromatic smell, but it smells tough at what level some people can identify versus what others people can. My approach is to use a gut check. If you can smell something in the air, there's likely something in the air. Be a very rare circumstance where there's a scent in the air where there isn't associated pollutants. So if something smells like chemically in the air and you smell it, there's probably something going on. That's sort of how I've seen it. These concentrations, so we'll have a better take on health effects after we can process this data. However, just if we look at the standard for benzoapyrene, for example, it's based on a 1 in a million incremental cancer risk, but that's being much exceeded. If you look at some of the concentrations that we measure, it's getting closer to maybe 1 in 10,000 risks that we've seen, but it really we'll have a better sense once we can actually look at cancer case data. And the other challenge is you can look at each pollutant individually, but realistically we're being exposed to the cocktail of pollution. So let's say each pollutant is relatively low, but you still have to think about that summation of all of those pollutants that you're taking in. These are questions we want to be able to I want to be able to give you better answers to. Without having this data that we've now collected, there was no way for us to do those calculations. Now that we have the data, we can start coming up with some numbers of, from everything from potential asthma cases to cancer. And we'll be spending probably the next 2 to 5 years really unraveling all of that within the context of Hamilton.
Thanks, Matt. And would, generally speaking, would the use of indoor air purifiers, I'm imagining, HEPA filters now due primarily to the pandemic are pretty common and accessible now. Would those help if you were using those inside?
Yes and no. It depends on which of the pollutants. Benzoapyrene really sits on small particles. It's not a gas when it's in the air. So the HEPA filter should be picking up those particles. Nitrogen dioxide, for example, though, it would just pass right through your HEPA filter. So it's a bit of a mix, but HEPA filters do work, but they are expensive. But if you have the option of getting one, I would recommend it, particularly with all of these challenges that we see around wildfire smoke. And there's alternatives to HEPA filters online where you can kind of make your own much cheaper. You just get furnace filters in a box fan and you tape it all up. Richard Corser, professor, came up with this idea for COVID, but it would also work for reducing those particles, particularly those elevated wildfire type events. If you can have a HEPA filter, yeah, it works for sure for most of them.
Thanks. And then just trying to give a good variety of questions here. How does the prevalence of the air pollution compare in Hamilton to the rest of the GTHA and the rest of Ontario more wildly?
For benzoate-pyrene, there isn't really going to be too many areas in the GTA where we're going to see similar concentrations. We have the largest emitter of benzoate-pyrene in Hamilton. So, you know, we kind of are seeing some of the highest concentrations we'd expect. For nitrogen dioxide, typically you're going to see some higher concentrations in sort of Toronto proper, where there's less mixing of the air and equal amounts of congestion, but we're up there for sure. Sulfur dioxide, again, not many sources, so we'd be on the higher end of that for sure in Hamilton as well.
And Matt, are you familiar with any other studies that have been done similarly to this one, with, you know, the variety of different monitors around the city for such an extended period of time in other municipalities?
Not any of our adjacent municipalities. No, it's just often it's not the type of work that gets conducted by the ministry, for example. And as professors, you know, we have to, you know, it was nice and we were funded with Health Canada and all the partners. You know, it's always tricky to attract the type of funds that are needed for this work. And that really can be kind of dependent on the view of different levels of government at the time. But I haven't seen anything as extensive, but there is good ongoing work by our federal and provincial agencies, but just not to digging down to such detailed levels of information.
Thank you, Matt. And I'm seeing a huge number of questions asking what can people do about it with regards to the industrial pollution. And I will just mention again, there's a new technical standards up on the ERO, and I believe that someone shared a link to that in the chat. If you registered for this, you'll certainly be hearing from us at Environment Hamilton about that now, because I'm seeing a lot of questions about it. But I really just want to emphasize as well that it's absolutely important that our local elected representatives hear about these concerns. If you are wondering why isn't the ministry doing more about this, the city of Hamilton doing more about this, be it industry or transportation emissions or what have you, I can confidently tell you that everyone on this call is absolutely committed to reducing that pollution. But it's incredibly important for our local representatives to hear about these concerns. Everyone on this call has an MPP. Everyone on this call has a city councillor. Reach out to them. Reach out to your MP as well and tell them that you're concerned about this and you want them to do something about this. And you want them to do more than what they've done already. So I just really want to emphasize that for everyone, in that we do have local representatives who can hear from you about your concerns about this. And particularly, if you have a progressive conservative MPP, definitely please contact them. We have two locally and they're currently in government. So it's absolutely vital that those two MPPs in particular hear concerns from local residents. As what we've seen from the data, it's not just a downtown core issue. Going through these questions, I'm seeing quite a few similar questions, and I want to give that variety, as I said before. But ultimately, I'm looking at one more, and I'm seeing from an anonymous participant, clearly the benzoate-pyrene is the headline and urgent priority here. But can we please focus on urgent solutions? They go on to say that the provincial government has been exempting industry from health standards. What can we do? I'm going to kowtow that into another few questions that Sally definitely got to as well. But if we can maybe just speak to a little bit more about what people can do on days where air quality is particularly bad, or anything that you can do on the day-to-day to address the air quality concerns. So Matt, if you wanted to speak to that. Yeah,
day-to-day, paying attention to the Air Quality Health Index. It's going to track most of the pollutants we've talked about today. Benzoate-pyrene isn't being measured in real time. So unfortunately, it's kind of, we only know about when it was increased retrospectively. because we have to collect the sample. However you do it, you have to collect the sample, bring it back to a laboratory and analyze it. That's just how that works. So unfortunately, we don't really have real-time measurements. But going indoors is typically the best solution. You're going to reduce your risk. Now I say that, and Sally mentioned this point, if going indoors also means you're going to be exposing yourself to great heat by being indoors with windows closed if you don't have air conditioning, I wouldn't recommend that approach. That heat can really warm up, especially in individuals who might be at risk. That can be another factor. So trying to get to a public space with cooling. But if you do have air conditioning and you can stay indoors, that will reduce your risk during those elevated days. But paying attention to those air quality advisories that we've been hearing more and more about this summer from wildfires in this past few months.
Thank you, Matt. We've now stretched it out to 8:16. I am very encouraged myself personally that a lot of the questions are very similar, talking about what we can do with regards to industrial pollution and weighing in on regulatory issues. I'm not going to ask all those questions now, but I just want to finally just give a huge thank you to Matt Adams and his team for the work that they've done. And I want to shout out a few other people who are on this call currently who were part of this project. Specifically, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Linda Lukasik, who was already called out by Trevor Imhoff. I want to thank Sally again, and then also thank Matthew Lawson from the City of Hamilton, Shelley Rogers from the City of Hamilton, who has done an incredible job keeping this running and facilitating a lot of the background work that's been happening for this. And then also, I just want to hand it over to you, Matt, if you wanted to speak to your team as well and thank them.
Yes, so big thank you to Alicia and Jack, who are two graduate students who have been doing a ton of the heavy lifting, but there's been about 10 U of T graduate students who have been involved with this project at some point. And thank you to everyone there. Also, I want to approach one of these questions that I keep seeing about, is Hamilton a safe place to live? I live in Hamilton. I'm not moving from these findings. We need to make improvements. We now have information to really push the government to make sure those projects around industry, such as electric arc furnaces and reduction of removal of coke production, occur. Like, we really need to use this to push our local council, like Ian said. I was involved and recently supported the Greensville group, who is dealing with the potential of plastic burning up in Greensville. And I watched a community mobilize and get that shut down. So yeah, I do live, Scott, Dundas, Hamilton, I think it's all the same. But there's an added risk to these health effects over the long term of your life. And let's really just push to make the community's air cleaner. There are a lot of great benefits from a health perspective to living in Hamilton. The amount of greenness we have across the entire city, so many health benefits, both mental and just general well-being. So don't want to scare anyone, but it's just, this is information we can use to push for improvement of our communities.
Thank you, Matt. I could not have said it better myself. For just a final technical standpoint, I saw a few other questions about, will the recording be available? Yes, we have made the recording available for all previous webinars as well. I'll need a little bit more time because I'll have to edit out a chunk that happened mid-meeting for us this time. And that should be available up on our YouTube at the Environment Hamilton YouTube, probably tomorrow afternoon after a little bit of editing. And then that will be shared widely. We, with this project, will also be presenting and doing our final report to Health Canada. And then as well, this information that Matt Adams has worked on, we are in continuous talks about how to present that to the public and make it more available. So definitely stay tuned. If you registered for this event, we now have your email and we'll only contact you if you only give us your email for this event. And we'll definitely be keeping everyone involved across the community. And I just want to thank you everyone for showing up. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your evening.